The British media is the most sort of is the grimmest embodiment of this kind of very deliberately cultivated proximity to powerful people. Whoever is prime minister, wanting to be close to them. So we have really now a kind of political journalism which is entirely toothless. And I think in the coverage of Gaza, criticism of Israel is likely to get you expelled from those exalted circles. And this is, I think, really is what keeps people so craven, makes them so cowardly. That, I think, is a relatively underexplored aspect of the coverage of Gaza. It's like what you really don't want is for that access to power being disrupted.
Trust in the media has not been particularly high in recent decades, but it's fallen to all-time lows in the aftermath of the Gaza genocide. That's particularly true with liberal publications. It's particularly true with people who hold progressive values. But it shouldn't be understated. These are society-wide phenomenon. People simply don't believe what they read, hear, and listen to when it comes to the mainstream media. But what does that mean for our politics? Will things only become more polarised over time if that belief and credibility doesn't return? And what can the left and socialists do to create something different? Today's guest is a writer, a historian, journalist. They wrote a fabulous book 14 years ago, From the Ruins of Empire, shortlisted for the Orwell Prize, an amazing overview of global history over the last 150 years. More recently, though, they're involved in a new publication, a magazine called Equator. I want to talk to them about why they set that magazine up, what on earth is going wrong with the media in this country, and where next, because so many of the shibboleths and presumptions of the 20th century are simply dissolving into dust. The world is transforming, but you simply wouldn't know that if you got all your information from the BBC, The Guardian, and the Times newspaper. It's in fact transforming far more than I think any of us realise. Pankaj Mishra, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you, Aaron.
Before we started, you said you don't often do these kinds of conversations, podcasts, etc. I don't blame you personally. However, you made something of an exception for Novara Media, not because of the fabulous curiosity of our audience, although that is, of course, true, but because you are involved in this project, Equator magazine. I have to say, I was reading it over the last couple of days. The editorial at the top is really, really interesting. Tell our audience a little bit about Equator. What is it? Why did you feel the need to produce this particular thing now in 2026?
I think, Aaron, you are probably one of the very few people who understand very quickly when I say that the inadequacies of the mainstream media have become so intolerable over the years for many people who work inside those institutions that so many of us have been dreaming of just a different way of describing the world, explaining the world, but could never really find the means, could never really come together to establish that or to create that institution, that necessary institution. It so happened that many of us who had been dreaming for a while were almost kind of forced to come together by the disastrous coverage of the genocide in Gaza. I think that really forced many of us to contemplate our existing commitments, writing commitments, journalistic commitments, and make certain hard decisions like, do we want to continue working within what seemed like increasingly diseased outfits, increasingly compromised outfits, covering up for the state of Israel, publishing fabricated articles, constantly engaged in this exercise that involved lies, propaganda, systematic falsehoods. I think it became very clear that you really cannot reform many of these institutions from within. And certainly the idea of reform itself seemed preposterous, presumptuous, because you and people like yourself are in a minority within these institutions always. So the only way forward was setting up a project like this, where you again give back dignity to the idea of truth, to the idea of exploration, to the idea of open, critical thinking on a range of issues. I think, quite apart from this now notorious coverage of Gaza on the part of the mainstream media, there was also realization amongst many of us that the way in which the Anglo-American media was covering the rest of the world was profoundly insufficient, if not completely misguided at times, and that these institutions had committed themselves, invested in an idea of Western supremacy, moral, political, military, economic, and the idea that the rest of the world had no option but to follow the Western model. That whole assumption, that whole set of assumptions had been breaking and had been breaking for a very long time, even before Brexit, even before Trump arrived. But there was really no awareness of this extraordinary, loss of credibility. And as a result, the coverage of places like China, the coverage of places like India was really shockingly incompetent in many of these esteemed, storied institutions of journalistic institutions of Anglo America. So I think it was imperative for us to establish something like Equator and give opportunity to this incredibly talented, very large global Anglophone intelligentsia that now exists across the world. That did not exist when I started out as a writer in the 90s, but now is a very large demographic. People who read, people who write, people who have access to the best things that are being said and taught in the world and have been taught and said in the world. So you're looking at an incredibly talented group of people who are profoundly underrepresented in the mainstream media today. Our task is to bring many of these writers and thinkers and artists into the limelight, to present this new generation of writers and thinkers to the world at large. So, very long answer to your question, but I think you can see the sort of different reasons, all connected, of course, that in a way almost forced us to start something like this.
Yeah, I mean, that really brings together three things that our audience certainly care about. The terrible events in Gaza and to a lesser extent the West Bank since 2003, failures of the media across the Anglophone world, and thirdly, the need for a different kind of media. And I think that, it's interesting that you obviously come on Novara Media saying these things. We're born from a similar kind of set of circumstances. This part of the publication from the top, and we're not going to talk about a magazine for the whole thing. You've also published some great books, including one of my favorite books of the last 10 years. It was written in 2012, but I didn't read it then. From the Ruins of Empire, a fabulous book, fabulous book. Really recommend everybody read this. This is one of those books, a bit like, I know it's hard to hear this when it's your own book. It's Mike Davis for me. It's just a really important book if you're a leftist.
That's very kind. Thank you.
If you're a leftist that cares about the longue durée and why the world is the way that it is, you have to read this, I think. We'll talk about that, though, in a minute. This part of the magazine from the editors, often these can be very sort of flaky and very art worldy and, four-syllable words that nobody quite understands. This isn't like that. And I find that really important, interesting, reassuring. Here's a paragraph, just building on what you said a moment ago. For decades, as the Indian sociologist Ashish Nandy observed, the West's message to the rest of the world was, our present is your future. It was a presumption that divided the globe into those who had reached the end of history and those still mired in the strife-ridden zones of the historical, foreclosing political alternatives before they could even be articulated. Every society, regardless of its history or culture, was expected to converge on the Anglo-American model. Gaza and Iran, you guys go on to say, alongside the grotesque freak show of American politics and the dead-end submission of Europe's Atlanticist elites, have shattered this illusion. So that's the moment within which this publication is being born. And again, I think many people listening and watching to this will intuitively understand what you're talking about there. When did this start? When did the termination of this worldview start? Because you're talking about the decline of the West in this book, and of course, this is going back right to the 19th century. We're talking about Gaza in 2023. But was there a key inflection point in the last 15 years where you thought the global order really is disintegrating? Or was it 2023? Is that the sort of hinge moment for a lot of this?
People like myself, I wrote a piece in The Guardian, I think it was 2014 or maybe earlier, called The End of the Western Model, where I challenged this idea that Western mode of politics, Western modes of organizing economies was something that could be imitated, emulated across the world. And that was the golden route, that was the route to prosperity for much of the human population. So those ideas were being challenged really, I think, right from the beginning of decolonization in the 40s and 50s. Because if you remember, decolonization involved liberating yourself from regimes of capitalist imperialism. So there was a very strong suspicion of Western modes of politics and economy. There was a very strong suspicion of capitalism that was shared by people in India, people in China. Remember, the experience of the Great Depression touched each one of these countries. So when they were thinking about what is going to happen in our new independent nation states, they were very clear about one thing, which is that they were going to differ. They were going to be very different from the way people in the West had organized their economies, because too much of that economic system was parasitic on systematic violence and injustice. And we had suffered the most from that kind of violence and injustice. So we needed a different path altogether. What actually happened, and I'm sort of really compressing a very long history here, we saw post-colonial nations actually fail to achieve many of their aims. So much of their energy was sort of lost in things like territorial consolidation. I mean, the tasks of nation building were enormous enough to waste so much talent and energy in these nation states. So by the end of the 1980s, which is also when the Cold War ends, these Western prescriptions gained in a kind of potency that they never had enjoyed previously. Before, they were challenged by post-colonial notions of what an economy should be doing, how an economy should be organized, who should it be primarily benefiting, the people rather than a small group of people. All these questions were being debated in these places, had been debated for a long time. But after 89, those debates just ended. And globally, suddenly there was a consensus that Americanization or American style globalization or US led globalization was the only way forward. And of course, this was not just an idea, this was also policy, World Bank, IMF, enforced by military power and economic power of the Western European and American communities. So I think that is when I would date the late 90s, the late 80s and early 90s. That is when this idea became hegemonic. Of course, those of us who knew something about the history of capitalism in Asia and Africa were obviously not going to be convinced that this was the way forward for these economies in the global south, in Asia and Africa, who had been dealt a very bad hand by modern history. Many of these nations really had been, in a way, condemned to the ranks of losers because of the way they were exploited during the era of imperialism. So it was almost impossible for them to achieve this prosperity that was being offered to them by these ideologies. So I think that's really is that idea really only that or the sort of weaknesses of this idea became apparent only when Western economies themselves started to get into trouble. And the financial crisis was one sign, and then the growing realization that China had emerged stronger and more speedily than anyone imagined or expected, and that it posed the most formidable challenge to Western power in the last 300, in the last 200 years. And I think that has really, in a way, completely transformed Western politics. It has transformed, in a way, the sort of civic cultures of Western societies. This is still something very underexplored. The whole sort of rise of the far right is intimately connected to the way China has emerged dominant in many ways, in many realms, in many sectors. I think the political and economic challenge of China is something that obviously was predicted a long time ago. And anyone who thought about decolonization knew that one day when China becomes sovereign, when China is able to take positions and policies on its own without external pressure, this country is going to be a formidable power. This was predicted a long time ago. And so something like that has happened. And actually, China's current strength is something that almost no one predicted. So this is the big change, and that has really completely exploded Western assumptions of power, and of course, the kind of intellectual arrogance that goes with that kind of power.
So I suppose there are several myths that have been sort of cracking or outright destroyed in the last kind of 20 years. One you say is 2008. I think that's obviously true. More recently, Gaza. And then you have, like you say, the rise of China. And, I think it's really important to say how recent this is. Even in 2020, if you were to say to people that China would be producing better electric vehicles than the Europeans, you would just be sort of mocked and derided. They would say, well, this is 30 or 40 years away. This isn't going to happen anytime soon. Of course, it literally has happened. We're now in that world. You can be in a provincial part of England and you can find a BYD Seal, a very impressive, larger car. So we're now in that world. And I think you're right. This has huge implications for the radical right in Europe. When I was speaking to Ranades Gupta recently about his new book, really fabulous book, very similar to this, sort of long, deep history. There's a part in his book where he says that you can only really understand Western hegemony through the prism of it running a trade surplus with China for the first time in 2,000 years, right? And that's a blip. And it's quite an extraordinary way just to look at it. This whole idea of European white Western superiority is premised upon the macroeconomic reality of running a trade surplus with this huge piece of territory on the other side of the planet. That's now finished. It's been finished for a while now. And we're going to have to adapt accordingly. And on top of that, of course, you have the whole superstructure of liberal democracy and universal suffrage and rights-based discourse. All of these were, one might argue, luxury beliefs that could be accommodated by the Western and European bourgeois because other parts of the world were left out of this kind of set of arrangements. Really extraordinary way to think about it. So let's put some flesh on this. Why does the rise of China make the rise of the far right in France or reform in the UK more of a thing? Because somebody might be watching this, GB News viewer, they vote for reform in the local elections. They might be saying, look, I want less immigration, Pankaj. What on earth does that have to do with Xi Jinping and industrial policy in Shenzhen?
Well, I think, China, like a very responsible nation state, has always believed in the idea of national strength. How do you create that national strength? By actually holding back, and this is the formula they arrived at later. In the early years, they experimented disastrously with certain very harebrained ideas, like the big disasters of the 1950s and 60s, which Mao Zedong indulged in. After that, they arrived at this sort of, in retrospect, a profound wisdom that you need to unleash certain entrepreneurial energies. At the same time, you need to exert very careful control over this system, this very different system of capitalism, and that you cannot let the capitalists form a kind of unaccountable oligarchy, which is what has happened in many Western European countries and, of course, notoriously in the United States. So China's had an industrial policy. Not only that, it's actually exercised very tight control over its billionaire class, over its sort of potentially oligarchic class. And As a result, China is a much more coherent nation state today than just about any nation state in the world. This is something we have to recognize. Iran is also an interesting example here. So, what China has done, invested heavily in health and education, and the comparison with India is also instructive. India did not do any of these things, so it's now lagging behind China by several decades because it did not make those initial investments in public health, in education, and in manufacturing. Of course, how are you going to make all those investments in manufacturing if you don't have a healthy and literate population? So China did all that very deliberately, methodically, over decades. And at the same time, what was happening in the United States and Europe? An ideological intoxication with neoliberalism, the steady empowerment of a globalized class of transnational businessmen, various sort of also a kind of financialization of the economy, which in a way took away all the sort of traditional advantages of Western European economies and the American economy, and landed us now with this sort of semi-criminal class of oligarchs, completely unaccountable, politically more and more deranged. If you look at people like Elon Musk or Sam Altman, and here is China rising, introducing new technologies practically every month. We are kind of suddenly presented with some new technological advance, especially in sort of green technologies. And what are we sort of reckoning with here? Profound inequality, a very angry population, incredibly angry population, and far right demagogues who want to distract attention, who want to distract people from the overwhelming failure of their economic system, and want to blame trans people, want to blame migrants, they want to blame everything except the people who've brought us to this sorry mess. I think, in that sense, if you look at the way China has developed over the last 40, 50 years, and the way Western Europe and the United States have embraced ideologies, have helped empower an unaccountable political class, an unaccountable business class, which at this point really is now completely devoted to the idea of a sort of neo-fascistic politics that we see very clearly in the political preferences of America's business elite, the way they've all sort of swung behind Trump so quickly, all the tech companies, all the social media companies, and also you see that process in Western Europe, and of course, the far right is using this situation, is channeling the frustration that many people feel into hatred and resentment of minorities, racial minorities, sexual minorities. This is an old game. It's so obvious. I think we shouldn't really spend too much time examining it.
So, on the point about China, I love this phrase as well. This idea that this is actually a proper country. I mean, I've said it a few times, often with a sort of centre right or right wing audience. We've chosen to become an economic zone. You can talk about patriotism and how much you love your country. We've chosen over the last 45 years to become an economic zone. These are countries. These are national communities, and that has a meaning which transcends. This kind of fetish for the individual and free market capitalism and so on and so forth. So I think that's a really important observation. And I think you're right about Iran as well. But here's where it gets really interesting, Pankaj, because when you saw Israel and the US waging war in Iran and there was this popular national mobilization, doesn't mean every Iranian in Iran supports the Islamic Republic of Iran, but clearly there were tens of millions of people rallying around the flag. They want to defend the territorial integrity of their country and so on. I saw many right-wingers on places like X saying, I want us to be like this. I want us to be a country. So on the one hand, I see what you're saying in terms of they want to demonize minorities. But there are also, I think, amongst the more sensible elements of these people, they look at China, and they're not necessarily even anti-communists. They look at China fundamentally as, yes, a communist project, but also a patriotic one. They look at Iran, yes, as an Islamic project, but also a patriotic one. And they think, well, actually, maybe the West has made some mistakes over the last 50 years and there is something to learn from these people. I think those guys are out there too. I think fundamentally, though, that would require for the West, for Britain, for Europe, a re-enchantment of politics, which you can't just do. You need to have a century of humiliation. You need to be defeated in multiple existential wars. You need to be, at the receiving end of Genghis Khan or something like that. It can't just happen. You can't just choose to do it. And then on top of that, I really don't think we realize the sort of intellectual inner life of the people that drove this process. And I'm not talking about Deng or Mao. I'm talking about millions of ordinary Chinese people that drove this process. And I think of Mao's wife, who was caught by the KMT, and she refuses to help them, and they kill her. Or I think of the founder of Huawei. I think his father had a bookshop, and on the front of the bookshop, he had a stall, and he used to let young children read the books for free. He was a comrade. He was a communist. And the rise of China is premised on, like I say, millions of people acting in often very selfless ways. It's very alien to our worldview, isn't it? We can't really understand that in the West. We can't really come to terms with it. So it's not really that surprising when, we start this conversation by talking about the lack of effective, decent coverage of India, China, etc. by the Western media, including Britain. It's not really that surprising, is it? Because it's almost like an entirely alien civilizational perspective. I don't mean to use right-coded words, but that's kind of what it feels like.
For people expecting Iran to collapse like a house of cards, they've been genuinely shocked to discover that there have been several generations of incredibly well-educated Iranians, not only in the sciences, technology, also in the humanities. They can make great videos, they can craft compelling narratives which are believed and sort of loved by hundreds of millions of people around the world. And the reason why people are shocked and bewildered is because they never really took a serious interest in what was happening within these countries, what their governments were doing, how did the people see themselves? Did they see themselves as part of a wider project? Yes, many people in Iran might hate the revolutionary regime, but at the same time, they're committed to a project of Persian nationalism, which in many cases helps them transcend this loathing, this particular loathing for a particular regime. Likewise, in China, there were many people there still are, millions and millions of people who are extremely unhappy with the regime in Beijing. At the same time, they do have an idea of collective welfare. They have a commitment to national strength, national wealth, national power, which again sort of makes them, I suppose, very responsible citizens. I think you have to remember that even in the UK, there was a moment after 45 when collective welfare was something that was taken up by politicians, that was embraced by journalists. I think something really bizarre happened from the 1980s onwards, the revolution of Thatcherism. Notions of neoliberal individualism became dominant, not just in the economic sphere, but in the way we look at ourselves, our sort of individual lives, our place in the world. I think the idea of individual ambition, the idea of emerging and making your mark upon the world, without any reference to your social setting or your sort of society at large. I think those ideas became really dominant across Western Europe and the United States after those achievements of the welfare state and New Deal liberalism, let's not forget. That was also premised on this notion of collective welfare. China, countries like Iran have never truly broken free of those ideas. And I think today, if people feel some kind of admiration for Iran, is that they're admiring, that a nation, a national community, when it stands together, even when divided politically, can achieve certain things. That a nation that is being corroded from within by these corrupt neoliberal ways of thinking about yourself and other people, I think those nations have steadily enfeebled themselves, and really robbed lives of meaning as a result. Because I think this notion of individual success, which many people chase, leaves many, many more people feeling like they've failed disastrously, fills them with self-loathing and disgust for themselves, and indeed envy and disgust for other people as well. Again, the kind of thing that is continuously undermining social cohesion. If you have a society where some ideas of sort of collective welfare are still in play, then I think this kind of individualism, this kind of selfish individualism, doesn't really have a very fertile soil, in which to grow. I'm saying this partly also because I grew up in India, where these ideas were fading by the late 80s. As I said, that was when the big shift happened, to new ways of thinking of your place in the world. In India in the late 80s, some residue of an older post-colonial commitment to this idea of we are all in this together, those ideas were still around. Many of us still believed in those ideas. But in the 90s, we saw steady kind of Americanization of large parts of Indian politics and certainly Indian civil society. And we sort of started to break free. I think what's interesting, what has happened in the last few days in India, we see a kind of reaffirmation of certain notions of, rights, not so much sort of individual rights, but rights of particular groups of people, rights of particular classes, rights of particular collectivities. And that's really important. That's a big breakthrough.
In terms of it not being fertile soil for the sort of success of individuals, I will walk around sort of quote unquote left behind towns in this country doing stuff for Novara, and the thing that for me characterizes Britain in the 2020s is addiction. Addiction to phones, addiction to gambling, addiction to pornography, addiction to vape shops, addiction. And I think it is the kind of the quintessential pathology of the sort of political economic world that we ended up in after the 1980s. Sometimes I'm in my garden and somebody will be watching really loudly YouTube shorts on their phone. And it'll be really loud, and I'll be just scrolling through that aimlessly for half an hour. And I'm thinking, 15 years ago, most people would see that and they said, this looks like mental illness. This is some weird compulsive behavior. But now everybody's doing it. And I view that, and you can say that all the way through to people living in halfway houses dealing with really significant addiction problems. And there's a spectrum there, and I think it really is an outgrowth of how we organise our society and the belief that there is no form of meaningful collective existence. I think that is fundamentally poisonous to people's kind of spiritual well-being. I wanted to just talk about a few things. You used a great word, bewilderment. That's exactly the word, isn't it? In terms of British or Western audiences, they see Iran not collapsing, they see China producing all these new technological innovations, they can see all manner of things, and they have no means of explaining it. And so, I mean, just quickly, where do you think that comes from? Does it come from racism? Is it intentionally done by media outlets to obscure the reality of the world? Because that doesn't seem like a very sensible thing to do. Let me give you one quick example. Have you read The Three-Body Problem?
No.
Oh, fantastic. Chinese science fiction. I read that trilogy of books and I thought the society that can produce this is extraordinary. That can produce writers like this is extraordinary. Or Huawei. They've got this extraordinary HQ where they've got loads of buildings modelled on parts of Europe. And apparently one of the buildings in Huawei has a huge fresco of the Battle of Waterloo. When I say this to people in Britain, they have no idea. There are people producing world-class digital products in China and they're being inspired by Napoleon and Wellington. Something huge is going on, but you have no idea about it. And so these are little touch points of, okay, something really remarkable is happening on the other side of the world. I don't mean to fetishize it, it's just true. Why is that being obscured and why are people bewildered? Is it on purpose? Does it come from deep-seated psychological prejudices? Is it wish fulfillment that we don't want these people to be up there with us?
I think short answer is residual imperialistic thinking, um, legacy of decades, centuries even, of intellectual dominance, unchallenged dominance, and the conviction that the way in which we have organized our politics and our economy is superior and ought to be followed by the rest of the world. And you organize your institutions around this project. The Economist is a very good example of this,
The magazine.
the magazine, right from the mid 19th century onwards. And it's been very explicit about this commitment to a certain idea of free market capitalism. I mean, there are lots of jokes about them constantly sort of identifying the same set of problems everywhere in every part of the world, which is, the inability to unleash capitalist energies. This is a problem they identify everywhere, no matter where it is, and the editorials about what the Indonesians should do about their economy. You ask yourself the question, like, who are these people writing these editorials? What knowledge do they really possess of a complex country like Indonesia, which is not to be reduced to its economy, but also an incredibly diverse population, incredibly diverse territory? But again, I think it's a certain kind of confidence that is very easily picked up if you go to a private school, if you go to Oxbridge, you go to their sort of debating societies, you learn to be fluent with a certain kind of vocabulary that you pick up. And suddenly you are there elevated into these positions, and there you are telling the rest of the world how to organize their lives. So I think it's a function of class, it's a function of nationality, it's a certain kind of civilizational identity that you inherit very early on in your lives that gives you the confidence that gives you the prerogative to pronounce so confidently on the politics and economy of all these other countries. But I think the consequences of that are really quite serious. And you can see that, very quickly in the way Iran has shocked everyone in just the last 3 months, in the way China has caused this profound bewilderment amongst political elites and journalistic elites. I'll tell you, I mean, when I first went to China, I had, until that point, I'd been reading systematically all the literature in English I could find on the country. I would read The Economist, I would read Time, Newsweek. These were still respectable publications back then. Newsweek now is really an outlet for conspiracy theories, but back then, there were still some respectable pieces in there. I was really shocked to discover in China a completely different reality. I mean, some of the things I wrote on China early on about the Chinese political intellectuals, about their literary figures, these were not articles that I'd really come across previously. The Chinese intellectual, in most Western eyes, was almost always a dissident, someone who was opposed to the regime. That was the figure they would write about. They had no time for the sort of several generations of Chinese thinkers produced by Chinese universities who were profoundly engaged with various Chinese problems and challenges and dilemmas, and were, coming up with solutions, very compelling diagnoses. So this was a whole world revealed to me only after I went there. This other stuff, the reporting in the Financial Times and the Economist, although the Financial Times did have some good reporting in these places, but a lot of this was ideological smokescreens. And you had to very quickly kind of discard them if you really wanted to understand where China was going. For so many of us who engaged with the country 20 years or more previously, what China is today hasn't come as a great shock, because we knew about the very dynamic inner life of that society, about the way generations and generations had developed, the kind of books they were reading, the kind of engagements they had with various aspects of Western politics or Indian culture. There was, just so much going on, and so much of that diversity and dynamism was obscured by this sort of monotonous coverage of China, what China should do about its economy, unleash the energies of capitalism. So this sort of bullshit, which was really, in a way, and there's no other really word for it, this sort of tissue of cliches, which at any given time, any time you pick up an issue of The Economist, you'll see some version of that argument in there. So this is what I mean by the inadequacy, the incompetence of so many institutions, journalistic institutions of Anglo-America, how they've managed to obscure this very complex reality and underprepared us for the challenges that arise when you confront that reality.
Is it a psyop? Because on the one hand, you're saying it's a residue of superiority, but on the other hand, you're saying somewhere like Newsweek is, the host of really conspiracy theories now. I think that's true. But there is a part of me that thinks that many of these outlets do try and intentionally mislead their audiences. I don't just think it's a residue of sort of cultural superiority and how these people are socialized in universities and so on.
Look, I think there's another way of thinking about it, which is that these periodicals really cannot depart from certain ideological and intellectual commitments they have made. You don't want to, in a way, disturb your subscriber base by doing that. You do not want to alienate your advertisers by doing this. So this is the sort of trap that many of these periodicals find themselves in. Whether or not they're aware of this trap is another question. Most of them are not. There is no way you can suddenly sit up and say, look, we made a terrible mistake in our coverage of China. We made a terrible mistake in our coverage of Israel. And now we are going to do something very different. Because you are going to end up alienating the people that you've been catering to all this time, the people you're dependent upon. These are the people who sort of, in a way, nurture your reputation. So there's a real problem here, and there's a certain kind of institutional conservatism that make these periodicals uniquely incapable of responding to utterly transformed realities. And I think that is also part of the problem, quite apart from the fact that there is this prerogative, this sort of imperial prerogative of pronouncing upon the state of the world with great confidence and conviction. There is also this, that the more you do that, the more you trap yourself into these postures with your audiences.
There's a great history of The Economist magazine.
By Alexander Zevin. Yeah. Yes, I reviewed that.
Yeah, it's a fabulous book. And there's a line in it, it's a very big book, isn't it? And there's a line in it where maybe you'll know this, where somebody says to, I think it may have been Beja, but I don't know, one of the editors, and they say, how should I write stylistically? It's really at the beginning of the publication. He says, you should sound like God. And I thought that really does encapsulate The Economist. So I think, again, many people are hearing what you're saying and they'll agree. The real inflection point for much of this was Gaza, right? Because people look at the BBC, they look at this or that newspaper and they think, well, I agree with some of their coverage, I disagree with some of their coverage. They can be trusted on this, pinch of salt there. But on what was a genocide, what was an extraordinary moment in the history of the world, but particularly the West, they were all found wanting, basically. Some better than others. CNN did some good pieces. Sky News did some good pieces. The BBC did some good pieces. But broadly speaking, it was the case. Why was that? And what are the implications of that? How much has Gaza now changed? Not just the impression of the West more globally, because I want to talk about people here as well. The levels of trust we now have in our sort of political media release, it does feel decisively changed after 2023, doesn't it?
It has. I think it's actually really exposed many of the weaknesses of Anglo-American journalism, especially the mainstream version. I think, this is going to be a long answer. There are many aspects to this. I think for me, the most important aspect, and I feel like relatively underexplored, is the class composition of many people who go into journalism today. Not by that, I don't mean a static idea of class. Not just people who go to university or go to the same school. We see those networks too, especially in sort of right wing institutions like the Spectator or the Sunday Times or many other places. But also, I think the idea that the journalists should be in proximity to the privileged class of politicians and businessmen, that idea has insidiously gone around and sort of in a way that's that kind of proximity to centers of power and wealth has become more acceptable than it ever should have been in the world of journalism.
When does that start? I know you're giving a long answer with
Yeah.
multiple parts, but that's quite
I
important.
think, my feeling is that when you look at the history of journalism, Anglo American journalism, right up to the 1970s, look at the way the Vietnam War was covered in the American media. Look at the way many of the British counterinsurgencies in various parts of the world were covered in Rhodesia or in Malaysia, in various parts of the world. You always had incredibly bold, brave truth tellers in all of these situations. People really, in a way, pushing back against the usual sort of official regime of propaganda, falsehoods. Um, even when many of those journalists came from the same class, went to the same schools, went to the same universities, I think there was this idea of journalism. At least a lot of people shared that idea. Uh, Something in which it's your primary duty to hold the powerful to account. At some point, it's very hard to actually define precisely when, but I think there was a broader cultural shift from the 90s onwards, where the ideals of wealth and power got a kind of legitimacy that they never had really previously. I think you must remember that the idea of writing as a vocation, and journalism is obviously part of that. There was something inherently anti-capitalistic about it. I think we were meant to be above it all. We were meant to be mounting a critique of existing social economic systems. We weren't meant to be complicit with it. That was something totally taboo, at least for writers of my generation. That you had to keep your distance, a very fastidious distance from powerful people, from rich people. Only then were you capable of speaking the truth. And this whole idea, this sort of cliche of speaking truth to power, I think it has its origins in those set of kind of commitments. The 90s onwards, I think that commitment began to slacken. And the idea that we should all aspire to be wealthy and powerful, we should aspire to be in their company, became more mainstream than at any other time. And this began to infect journalists, and I also include novelists. I mean, I see a lot of people in the sort of world of literary fiction who hanker, who crave the most conventional forms of success, of the kind they would be much better placed to achieve if they were in banking or in the city or on Wall Street. But nevertheless, they want to achieve it through culture, through cultural production. Uh, within the world of journalism too, and I suppose the British media is the most sort of is the grimmest embodiment of this kind of very deliberately cultivated proximity to powerful people. Whoever is prime minister, wanting to be close to them, where is going to be the next minister, whatever department, the desire to be close to them. So we have really now a kind of political journalism which is entirely toothless, which really retails gossip of a very conventional sort. In I think in the coverage of Gaza, which many people, for many people, the conventional explanation is that these people have certain commitments to Israel or to the idea of Zionism. This is what prevents them from speaking truthfully about it. Yes, I think there's some truth to it, and there are certainly instances of columnists, prominent columnists, the Guardian's chief political commentator, who was sort of shilling for a genocidal regime. And I think it's perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine for many writers and journalists to openly express their allegiance to a genocidal state and not really suffer any consequences whatsoever. I think it's perfectly acceptable. And there is that minority. But I think many more people do not want to disturb these connections that they have forged to the wealthy and powerful in their respective societies. And criticism of Israel is likely to get you expelled from those exalted circles. And this is, I think, really is what keeps people so craven, makes them so cowardly. That I think is, I find that is really relatively, as I said, relatively underexplored aspect of the coverage of Gaza. It's like what you really don't want is for that access to power being disrupted. This, I don't know if you saw this New Yorker piece last week on the Biden administration officials who were arming Israel all through the early months of its genocide. They, of course, now realize that public opinion in the United States has turned decisively against the state of Israel. Many, many more Americans sympathize with Palestinians. There are going to be electoral consequences of that. We're already seeing them. The Democratic Party is going to, at least many, many people within the Democratic Party are going to distance themselves from Israel lobby groups. So people who are now looking for jobs in the next Democratic administration are now repositioning themselves. People who were tainted by their involvement, their complicity in a genocide, now want to offer an explanation for it. And this journalist for the New Yorker gives them a platform to do precisely that. Of course, he's not going to ask them very tough questions like, you said this on a particular date. This is what you said when a journalist asks you about this. There's so much evidence that shows they knew what they were doing. They knew that Israel was out of control. But he's not going to ask them that questions. He's offering them a platform. Why is it that? Is the journalist ideologically committed to Zionism? Unlikely. It's more that if you move on those social circles, if you've known these people for a long time, you really want to, in a way, help sustain their reputation. Also because your reputation, too, is very profoundly connected to theirs. You belong to a social class, you belong to a group of people who rise and fall together. And so I think it's these loyalties that have to be untangled when we sort of try to explain, why the coverage has been so bad, why the coverage continues to be so bad. It's a class of people who have loyalties to each other, who want to help each other, who believe in the good intentions of both themselves and the good intentions of other people. And they want to use that idea of good intentions to now explain why they acted in the way they did. So what is the main explanation here, which is that these people had good intentions. They tried to prevent this, but ultimately they just couldn't see very clearly what Israel was doing, which is completely false and completely easily demonstrated by the things these people said and did in the past. So this is now the cover-up of the crime that is happening. And it's happening because, again, people belonging to the same class have come together to support each other. And journalists don't think in the way they did in the 1960s that I'm going to expose the criminal acts of the best and the brightest, the title of a famous book about Vietnam War, the sort of manufacturers of the Vietnam War. in the 1960s. There is no such book being written right now. Why is that? We have to ask ourselves why. Like, why are journalists not willing to betray their class and turn against the people that they've gone to university with, who now revolve in the same circles in New York, in Washington, D.C.? Why are they not willing to betray these people? Why did we not know about Joe Biden's very obvious senility? That was obvious in 2020 when he was, in standing in elections against Donald Trump. Why was that such a closely guarded secret? Surely people knew about this. So, I mean, this is again very long-winded explanation, but I do think we have to examine the ways in which journalism, the way we knew it, doesn't exist anymore. It's become really too. It's allowed itself to become a mouthpiece for the wealthy and powerful in our societies. The more obvious cases are, of course, Bezos and Murdoch actually owning periodicals and imposing. But the more insidious versions of this kind of proximity to wealth and power are to be found in the liberal periodicals. They are to be found in The Guardian. They are to be found in the New Statesman or these other American periodicals.
Yeah, The Guardian for me is sort of quintessential one, right? And I don't think people understand actually how different the British media landscape was even before Murdoch buys the News of the World, I think in 1969, maybe 1968, and then he buys The Sun in 1969. The Sun was previously the Daily Herald. It was the publication of the TUC at one point, quite a remarkable turnaround. Let's stick with The Guardian for a minute. I mean, because you've written for them before, so have I. What's your view of The Guardian? How should the left look at them? What do they represent? What's the project going on there? Because obviously you're part of a publication which isn't coming for their lunch, but it's a similar target audience. What do you make of The Guardian? Is it sort of just finished as a serious publication to make sense of the world? Because I don't. It's very rare that I feel enlightened reading something in The Guardian. I do with the FT. I actually do sometimes with the New Statesman if it's a, insider story about the Green Party or the Labour Party, but very, very rarely with The Guardian. So, how should we look at a publication like that?
I think, I don't want to be too critical of The Guardian, but in some very important instances, it has demonstrated some very profound weaknesses and a lack of courage, I think. Intellectually, I've never really, it was never meant to be an intellectually rigorous periodical. It's a newspaper, it's a daily newspaper. And, the book's coverage used to be extremely good. They had an excellent supplement, which has now been folded into the weekend magazine. So that's a big loss. The space for essays is primarily in the long reads, which continues to be excellent. So I think my feeling is that The Guardian should be doing a lot more, and it was doing a lot more in the past. But I think it suffers from a very profound lack of courage at this point. It has the resources, it has the people, but I think the political journalism really is unbelievably shoddy. You look at this sort of blanket support for Keir Starmer, for instance. Also, the way the Guardian handled the whole sort of Corbyn affair in the Labour Party, it's been profoundly disappointing to many people, including I know people who worked for the Guardian in the past. So it's really, in a way, I suppose, you could say that the Guardian cannot perhaps be exempt, cannot be immune to these wider corruptions that we've been talking about. And I think, the temptation to be close to power, to benefit in some ways, even like emotionally and spiritually, from this proximity to absolute power, that temptation, as I said, is harder and harder to resist for many people because they're not committed in the way people used to be to the idea of writers and journalists standing apart and mounting their critiques from that that sort of position of and from that distance.
You know, while we're talking about this, I'm reminded of Andrew Marr, who has written fiction. You know, your next book is about fiction, right? It's coming out in October, I believe, with Verso.
It's a collection of essays, yeah.
Yeah. It looks fabulous and fascinating. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But Andrew Marr, of all people, and he was the political editor at the BBC, wrote this novel. And would you like to know where the launch party for the book was?
No, where was it?
Number 10 Downing Street.
Yeah.
And it's just, does nobody sort of step back for a minute and think, well, the Prime Minister probably shouldn't be doing you a favour as the political editor of the BBC. I mean, I think my sort of semi-literate Iranian great-grandfather who was a farmer would probably understand the logic there. And yet it seems beyond the gift of supposedly very educated
But also
people.
the Spectator summer party. I'm sure you saw Nasreen Malik's piece in The Guardian a week ago about the Spectator now really, explicitly Islamophobic rag. It's been moving in this direction for a while now. I've not opened this rag for many years. I occasionally come across pieces that people send me published there, and it's just truly extraordinary the depths to which this once elegant magazine has sunk. Even people who used to write for it don't want to open it, don't want to touch it at this point. And you think about this Spectator summer party, the elites fully represented there, not just the Tories, but also the Labour Party, various members of the journalistic class also present there, even people who are ideologically opposed to the Spectator. So again and again, I think the sense of a very small community of people who are continuously supporting each other because their own reputations, their own careers depend upon that support. That sense grows stronger and stronger. You know, it's like we have to support each other because otherwise, who have we got left, really? So you support Keir Starmer, even though it's become very clear he's so despised by people in this country that he has to actually leave 10 Downing Street. He's forced to leave. And yet you keep publishing articles saying he wasn't so bad. There was a newsletter that went out from the Financial Times. You know, he wasn't as bad as people make him out.
Was it Stephen Bush, was it?
I can't remember who it was.
Probably was, but I mean, no.
But it's like, look, this man is being forced out because he lost elections. He took Labour Party to its worst place, in decades. And that's why the Labour Party itself is getting rid of him. Why do you think he was such a good guy, such a decent man? I mean, not to mention all the various sort of things he did, whether the sort of arming of genocide in Gaza or cracking down on protesters against the genocide, lying on various occasions. But again, you have to keep saying that he was a decent man. Because you too yourself, your career, your reputation is too connected to the fortunes of the class that all of you now belong to.
I'm really looking forward, because I suspect he won't last very long in the House of Commons. I'm really looking forward to that by-election. Because whatever people say about the Greens' national polling and Burnham taking back many voters, which I think is happening, I think in that by-election, I think the Greens will do very well, and I think they'll probably win the seat. And I think that would be a lovely full stop on the political career of Keir Starmer. And it's really fascinating, to see these things coming from journalists. Because one lucky thing for me, and there's many good things about living in London. One good thing about not living in London is that I get to talk to people who aren't necessarily in the capital, who aren't immersed in these kinds of debates. And my wife is a Labour councillor. And I can say this now because Starmer is no longer the PM, but she would go canvassing ahead of the May local elections, where I think all of her colleagues who were up to be elected or re-elected, none of them won. I was talking to her, she'd be canvassing most weeks, and she'd be like, "This is easily the worst it's ever been. Easily, it's worse than the European elections in 2019, easily." And there are just many people in London who are literally paid to proffer valuable political information who refuse to accept that. And I find it really interesting. And often, it's sad, but I think if you want to be really poorly informed, you should basically believe absolutely everything that the BBC and The Guardian tell you, and then you really won't have much of a grip on reality. Um, in terms of the sort of big geopolitical picture, because I want to talk about this, and again, I have to say, this is a really fabulous book. Actually, let me quote from this book because people might be thinking, well, he keeps on talking about how good this book is. Why should I believe him? There's all kinds of fabulous quotes in this. This one is from Tagore. It's from 1921, and it's very pertinent to now. Those who live away from the East have now got to recognise that Europe has completely lost her former moral prestige in Asia. She is no longer regarded as the champion throughout the world of fair dealing and the exponent of high principle, but rather as an upholder of Western race supremacy and the exploiter of those outside her own borders. That's over 100 years ago, but it feels very apposite for the United States in 2026. Of course, that was written in the aftermath of the Versailles Treaty, what happens in Paris in 1919, where even though Woodrow Wilson is talking about nationalism and national self-government, he's really just talking about Europe. The Indians, the Chinese, the Persians are locked out from that. That's a really important moment in terms of the politicization of the global South. Something similar again in 1945 or the years after 1945. Are we living in a similar moment now, post-Russia, Ukraine, post-Gaza, where global publics outside of the West are recalibrating their worldviews? So yes, of course, on the one hand, there is a loss of prestige in the West, but as we see with Tagore, that's not necessarily entirely new. But is there something else going on where actually they're now beginning to look to other places for moral and political leadership? And where is that coming from?
I think, in a way, the revelation that so much of what was described as Western civilization was profoundly deficient. That revelation, which was once confined to members of elites in Asian and African countries, people like Tagore, or Liang Qichao in China, Sun Yat-sen, he's made his famous speech in 1924. He said, Western civilization is nothing but the rule of might. We don't want to listen to too much talk about liberalism and democracy. Likewise, Gandhi, very clear about what this democracy really consisted of, what it actually meant for many people being racially abused in large parts of Asia and Africa. That realization that we've been sold an idea of the West that is profoundly false, that realization is shared by hundreds and hundreds of millions of people today. So it's not just something confined to the elites. It is now something that is now the conviction of people everywhere, in India, in China, in Brazil, in of course, in the countries that have always been traditionally hostile to the West, such as Russia. And I think that conviction now is unlikely to be overturned. And in a way, I think that sort of anti-colonial diagnosis, that so much of Western rhetoric about bringing civilization to the natives was hypocritical and self-serving. That kind of realization now is amplified in a variety of ways, whether it's rescuing the Iranian people from the regime and the rebuttals that are being now offered of that kind of rhetoric, that you now see, resonating, being amplified from different parts of the world. So in that sense, I think the earliest anti-colonial rhetoric is now really resonating globally. It's no longer coming from small groups of people within Asian and African countries. It now it's kind of the expression of popular sentiment.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm going to go back to the book again because it's just so good. And I think there's just so much in it. There are so many vignettes which really just underscore how little we understand about our own history. It's about Ho Chi Minh in 1990.
I must tell you, actually, Arun, sorry to interrupt, but I must tell you why I wrote this book.
Please go on.
Because I grew up in India, and did not leave the country until I was in my mid 20s. So when I first came to Europe and the United States, I was an obsessive kind of book buyer. So every town, every city I went to, I would go into the bookshops and find books and books of history, books of intellectual history. And at that time, especially in the late 90s, early 2000s, it became clear to me that the way in which global history had been taught was being popularized in England and in America, especially, was really shockingly inadequate. And not just inadequate, but sort of dangerously misleading. People being told that the British Empire pioneered free trade, it introduced the natives to democracy. This was something that was in the BBC documentary on the British Empire, hosted by Neil Ferguson. It was there in various books being authored at the time. And for someone who'd grown up in India, being told, and obviously, this truth was verified by the whole kind of political career of many leaders, the national narrative was that imperialism essentially destroyed what once were rich, politically diverse societies. And here were people in Britain and America being told that, the empire, the British Empire, was a hugely beneficial entity. It did a great job in making the modern world. And now the Americans should come and assume these imperial responsibilities and finish the great job the British started. It was really truly extraordinary for me to come across this kind of discourse, which was mainstream. It was not confined to the far right. Of course, now the far right speaks in this way at all. But you have to remember, this was going mainstream much before the far right embraced this. So I decided to write this book in order to combat some of these notions and to actually present just how some of the greatest writers, thinkers, artists in Asia really responded to the challenge of imperialism and to present a different story altogether. So that was really the motivation behind it.
And it is very illuminating. Let me read from this, and we'll get back to Niall Ferguson in a minute. Ho Chi Minh would not have bothered with renting a morning suit had he not known, of course, Ho Chi Minh famously, for people who want to know, went to Paris in 1919, had he known that the cerebral Wilson believed as much as his temperamentally bellicose rival Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, quite a racist dude, in America's responsibility to share the white man's burden, just as Kipling had exhorted. In January 1917, Wilson, now remember, when we're at school in Britain, we're told Woodrow Wilson was a really good guy, really nice, liberal man. Wilson argued that America should stay out of the war in order, as he said in a cabinet meeting, to, quote, keep the white race strong against the yellow, Japan, for instance, as he told his Secretary of State, Robert Lansing. Wilson believed that, quote, white civilization and its domination of the planet rested largely on our ability to keep this country intact. There's just so many things like that peppered throughout the book. And of course, people are familiar with these kinds of things being said by, again, Teddy Roosevelt, but not Woodrow Wilson. Not the kind of the sort of the founding fathers of what we might call 20th century internationalism. And yet it's all there. And so I think it is a very valuable sort of project. And these are the sorts of books, because we were talking about this before, and you were saying, books come and go, and I don't want to necessarily be given praise as a writer. The fabulous thing with books is, and I found that with my own one, is of course they take a hell of a lot of time to write. But their afterlives are extraordinary. Somebody might get in touch with you, like my book came out in 2018, but somebody will get in touch with you 8 years later, quite a famous person maybe, or an interesting person, and they say, I read your book and it inspired me to do this. And, I know it's a strange thing to say, but in 100 years' time, maybe not many people, maybe just one or two people, they'll be thumbing through this book or that book, and it'll be inspiring thoughts, which, as much as I'd like it to be true about this YouTube video, highly unlikely. In terms of the sort of conservative elites, and Niall Ferguson is one of those people, is the British conservative kind of intellectual milieu, are they uniquely stupid? Are they uniquely incurious? Because I look at French sort of right wing intellectual. This isn't just kind of like Europhilia, by British sort of leftist. I look at the sort of the intellectual wins in France. I don't agree with much of what they do, but it doesn't feel like Britain is producing people like Michel Houellebecq, for instance, or all the political figures they have, the kinds of debates they have. I think many of which are horrific, but at an intellectual level, they're operating at a much higher level than we are here. Even somebody like Nigel Farage today, could be the next prime minister, although maybe that's looking less likely these days, is basically just reheated Thatcherism. So what's so unique about the sort of British, I'd say British, not even Anglo-American, the British conservative mindset, and why is it so low rent, so unintelligent, so incurious?
You know, I can remember when I first came to the UK in the 90s, you could pick up the Telegraph, you could pick up the Spectator. Both magazines, both periodicals had excellent books coverage, really well written reviews, very kind of, upholding an idea of intellectual integrity. Even when they were politically hostile, the hostility was expressed elegantly, often persuasively. And I've seen them over time, especially in sort of the last decade and a half, turn into real kind of grotesque parodies of themselves. A certain kind of right wingery that was always there, now becoming the most egregious, the most dominant feature, to the point where it's impossible to open these magazines or newspapers without feeling insulted, even somewhat contaminated, soiled, I think is the word I'm looking for, because they're so atrocious and so offensive. And offensive not because they are racist, explicitly racist at times, but because they are intellectually so shoddy. The articles are so poorly written, lacking, just all style, all elegance. Spectator used to be really particularly well known under Alexander Chancellor, one of its editors, for really being an incredibly well written magazine. Today, really, I think it's just impossible to find anything well written in it. So my explanation for that is that this particular intelligentsia, if one can call it that, the right wing intelligentsia, mind you, I mean, there are exceptions. The TLS, for instance, and it's interesting to explore, maybe we don't have time for that, why the TLS has continued to uphold some very high standards. It's owned by Murdoch. It's not explicitly right wing. It's not politically, it's hard to distinguish it really. But it continues to be a decent rival to the London Review of Books, which is, of course, intellectually far superior. Um, but it's a good rival to the LRB and the New York Review of Books. But the other right wing periodicals today are frantically racist and offensive, deliberately offensive, in a way that speaks of a certain kind of panic, a panic induced by an increasingly diverse population. The fact that a certain kind of intellectual domination that these people exercise is no longer unchallenged. And there are challenges all over the place. There are media outlets, people of different backgrounds, racial backgrounds, national backgrounds, now writing, presenting their own perspectives, presenting their own experiences. And because they had deliberately, methodically shut themselves off from the possibility of learning new things, they find themselves in a real panic about their own incomprehension of the world. And that has forced them into the most infantile postures of incomprehension, crude mockery, the crudest forms of racism, for instance, and of course, incredibly bad writing. So I think one should examine this question of why is so much of the right-wing British media so bad, with reference to the intellectual dominance that they enjoyed over a long period, and which was then finally challenged. And their own, what they're really confessing to today is their sheer confusion and bewilderment before a rapidly changing their world, before a rapidly changing world, and their total inability to understand it. It's too easy to say these people are, you know, genetically racist or they've always been like this, because I do remember a time, and other people will confirm this, when the same periodicals carried perfectly good pieces on a range of subjects. So I think if they have degenerated, we have to examine what caused this degeneration. What were the real reasons behind this degeneration? And not just arrive at some facile explanation that they've always been racist.
I mean, there are still some good writers in these places. So in the Telegraph, there's Ambrose Evans Pritchard, I think it is, the sort of business correspondent who, is a columnist. I think he's always really interesting. Someone like Unheard, Wolfgang Munschau, who I still in my mind think of as basically a Financial Times guy, has quite interesting centre-right analyses of, the German car industry or whatever. But you're right that generally speaking, there isn't an outlet and you go, these are really serious people. You get it with the FT and that's kind of about it. And it's really interesting when you go abroad, you might go to, the Nordic countries and you'll go to, I don't know, a train station in Oslo. I distinctly remember this. And, you've got the New York Times, you've got the FT, you've got Weekend Avis and their Danish weekend newspaper. You've got, a couple of Scandinavian titles. And you think, well, the FT's there, but why isn't the Sunday Telegraph? What's happened? Because like you say, 30 years ago, or the Sunday Times, these were really serious, robust international outlets, and that's completely gone. I suppose one argument would be that as a culture, we just place less importance on the written word. Is that part of it? Although I do think the generation, by the way, it's also true on the left, but I do think it's much more markedly obvious on the right. But do you think there's the cultural shifts as well play something of a role? I know you've got a daughter, for instance, so you probably have these conversations about where do people consume media, how do they consume it? You obviously like the printed word. So do we at Novara Media, even though we don't have printed objects for sale. But that must play a role as well.
That probably plays a role in the way that clickbait is prioritized. It's not so much the movement away from text. It's the fact that many media institutions feel like they have to continuously offer lurid, sensationalist stuff to the readers. So if you open the Times or the Sunday Times, it's full of fabricated stuff. Someone, Muslims mostly, being blamed for something or other. Whether it's Labour Party's policy shift on Gaza, they'll be blamed for it, and so the Labour Party is doing it. It's because of these Muslims, and I think that's because you have prioritized the possibility of getting more and more people to look at your lurid headlines, even when you're aware that this may not be actually true, that a lot of people, apart from the Muslim population of this country, were truly appalled by the Labour Party under Keir Starmer. You're not unaware of this fact, but the fact that you're leading with that story means that you really want to attract a lot of people who really want to believe that story. And so that's how you lose intellectual integrity. You end up essentially fabricating stuff and putting it out there for more and more people to consume and then to disseminate, and at some point it becomes entrenched wisdom. No matter that a majority of the British population is opposed to genocide or thinks genocide has happened and is opposed to Israel, but you continue to do that because you have this particular audience. So it's not so much, to answer your question, the movement away from text. It's a movement away from a serious commitment to truth telling to a very commercial sort of motivation to create clickbait headlines and reports.
You know, at our local church, which we do go to, it's a Catholic church, there was a fundraiser for MAP, Medical Aid for Palestinians, about a year ago. And, you know, some of the people there were Muslims with, you know, hijab or without, for that matter. But there were many more white British people, Christians, Catholics, Protestants, and, you know, they were buying and selling things to raise money for MAP. And this obviously is not unique to where I live. This is happening across the country. And it does feel utterly extraordinary that, you know, it's just wholly unreflected in how the right-wing press has covered this stuff. Look at Andy Burnham. Andy Burnham has not changed Labour's position on Gaza. I wish he had. He said a few things. But obviously lots of Green voters are considering going back to Labour because of what he's saying about the domestic economy. But according to these people, actually, the Green Party was polling 15 to 20% purely because of Gaza, purely because they'd hoovered up all the Muslim votes. If that was the case, then we wouldn't be seeing a realignment happening at the moment. That may, of course, be temporary. Kind of alternative realities they're constantly carving out. I'll finish with a question about your next book. It's on literature. Why are there so few interesting novels being published in Britain, but particularly since 2008? We've had this enormous cultural, political shift. Brexit, generational polarisation, regional inequality. In many ways, Britain is, I think, the most interesting place right now in the West, if not the world. I've not been to the whole world, so I don't know, but it's fascinating to cover. So why are there so few interesting literary explorations of this stuff?
Well, I think I'll probably disagree that there hasn't been interesting fiction since 2008. There has been, and I think...
What books?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, I'm not an avid reader of contemporary British fiction. I sort of... Very, very rarely would I pick up a contemporary novel set in Britain, because I'm, you know, this book is actually about it's a book of essays, and it's a book of essays about books set in places like Egypt and Turkey and Mexico, and of course India and China. So I'm more interested in this book at looking at how writers in the non-Western parts of the world have responded to their rapidly changing societies. How have they written about those changes in the fictions they've produced? And in the process of examining that, I also look at a lot of fiction written and published in Europe and America over the last 40, 50 years, especially fictions that have also tried to engage with realities outside of Western Europe and the United States. A book set in, you know, remote Asian and African countries. I think the big change that I see, to answer your question in a somewhat roundabout manner, the big change I see is that there is less engagement with the world outside the West in so much of the fiction that is coming out from Britain and America today. I don't really understand why this is so. Maybe it has something to do with the kind of change institutional setting of writers in Britain and America today, the different kind of imperatives that make them in a way fixed in one place, doesn't allow them to travel so much, doesn't allow them to expose themselves to these other realities. Because in the past you had, of course, this, you know, very long tradition of people traveling, writing about other places, not even necessarily traveling, but also coming from very interesting places and then returning to them in their fictions, whether it's Doris Lessing. Remember, she was born in Iran and spent a lot of time in Africa, and she returned to that setting many times. And there are other examples, you know, Graham Greene. Coetzee is probably the last sort of living example of that particular tradition and experience of several continents, you know, Africa, Europe, America, now in Australia. So I think that breadth of experience has gone missing from much contemporary fiction. You also have to remember that um, a fictional reflection on events, especially big political earthquakes, big calamities, historical calamities, it takes a long time for that reflection to be realized in compelling works of fiction. You know, think about the time it took from the Napoleonic, the big invasion of Russia by Napoleon, and the time Tolstoy composed War and Peace. Uh, and when you look back, it all seems very compressed, but actually decades had to pass before he could think about all the generals and the families, the big families that were involved, whose lives were uprooted during that invasion. So I think I would give some more time to many contemporary novelists who obviously find themselves in a situation that they certainly never expected. I think it's a particular shock for many writers in America who had always existed within the assumptions of a stable, continuous society. And for them, I think the large political earthquakes of the last decade or so have been especially disorientating because they were simply not accustomed to something like that. I think those of us who've grown up in places like India have always lived with political emergencies. Many of us have lived with civil wars, secessionists, counterinsurgencies, all kinds of calamities and historical disasters. So perhaps we don't find them so unexpected. But I think if you belong to the richest society in the world, then you're not really expecting things to go bad as quickly and as dramatically as they have in recent years. So I think it'll take longer for American writers to reckon with these altered circumstances of theirs. But you have to remember there are also people who've come to Britain and the United States from other societies who are now taking the measure of these new societies that they find themselves in, but also their own societies, so sort of immigrant writers. So there's a I think there's a lot of movement. There's a lot of potential there for a new kind of richness of imaginative writing. So I think we're all kind of emerging from assumptions of national self-sufficiency and are forced to contemplate this vastly enlarged world where things are so bewildering, things are so complexly interconnected. It's a huge challenge for a novelist because novelists traditionally have always worked within well defined boundaries of the nation state. They've traveled, as I said, they've exposed themselves to other places, but they've always worked within those assumptions. And those assumptions are no longer available. We are now we have been living with political chaos for some time, for more than a decade now. And I think it's a particularly traumatic thing for writers who are not accustomed to living like this or thinking in these dark times.
And that hybridity now that you see in almost every culture is really challenging to the genre. But I wonder, the non-reproduction of the middle class, to me, is the big story of Britain over the last 18 years. The downward mobility of the middle class, the unmet expectations of the middle class. And I say that as somebody who literally graduated in 2007. I saw it happen in real time. Our final year as university undergraduates at UCL or LSE, the people I would hang around with, everybody was talking about going to work for Deloitte and McKinsey and RBS. And within 18 months, none of those guys were hiring. And actually, the headcount of all these organizations is either the same or lower than it was almost 20 years ago. It's quite extraordinary. And I still think that, I find it remarkable. Maybe it's out there, I've just not found it. There aren't many interesting literary expressions of that downward mobility. Maybe it'll come.
Well, have you read Douglas Stewart, for instance?
No.
Yeah. So there are people there, but I think I would agree with you that writers with a certain experience of the world that accommodates that experience of adversity primarily, those writers are fewer and fewer. I think writing became a middle class activity. And so people who could describe for us the experience of downward mobility, even the experience of destitution, which is, the experience of many people. That experience, I think, I'm not the only one saying this, has gone missing. I've actually written about this. There's an American writer I admire greatly called Elizabeth Strout. Um, Elizabeth Strout is remarkably, one of the very few novelists today talking about class and downward mobility in fiction, in Anglo-American fiction. And you have to ask yourself, why so few? It's because, this is someone who started writing quite late in her life, after certain life experiences, which actually made her very intimately acquainted with some of these lower middle class experiences, or middle class experiences. Um, so her works are really compelling in a way that so much of contemporary fiction isn't, because she's writing out of a certain experience of the world. If you're a writer who went to creative writing school at the age of 18 or 19, graduated, got a advance through your agent, through a short story in the New Yorker, or somewhere else, and then establish yourself as a professional writer of novels, one novel every 3 or 4 years, where is the life experience here? So I think that's the other thing that has happened, is a certain kind of institutionalization and professionalization of writing that has, in a way, kept the writer, has, really formed a barrier between the writer and the world at large. So you have books today made out of other books. People write because they're inspired by something they've read, not because they've experienced something very piercingly, very powerfully, even painfully. And that's where someone like Elizabeth Strout or Douglas Stewart stand apart. That's where you see that, okay, these people have actually, lived through and then reflected powerfully and effectively on that experience. And we need more writers of that sort.
Pankaj, it's such a pleasure. And I should say, this is the first edition. When's the second edition out
Second
of Equator?
edition should be out in October. In the meantime, I would encourage everyone who's listening or watching to this to please subscribe, to please donate, to please do whatever you can to support this venture, and indeed support Novara Media. We desperately need more and more platforms, and certainly need these existing platforms to flourish.
Yeah, I'm 42, so for some people I'm old now. I know, my parents might not understand that, but kids do, teenagers do. So I love print, but I think this would excite most people, Pankaj. You see the first article, I think Jack will like this one. The Xi Jinping School of Journalism. I mean, who doesn't want to read this stuff? And also, it's a little bit. It's a little while since it was published, but this really is a fabulous book, and I do really recommend it, From the Ruins of Empire. Pankaj, thanks for joining us on Downstream.
Thank you, Aaron. It was a pleasure.